Welcome to the Chinook Fund's online grant application workshop. This online grant application workshop is designed to help prospective applicants better understand the Chinook Fund's funding guidelines and funding processes. The Chinook Fund last revised its guidelines as of January 1st of 2013. These guidelines revisions were in direct response to feedback given by current and former grantees during an extensive grant-making evaluation in 2012. The revisions reflect the Chinook Fund's commitment to be responsive to the organizations and communities we fund. For easier use and for convenience, this workshop is divided into 3 parts. This is Part 1. In Part 1, we will explore the Chinook Fund's history and values, as well as the philosophy behind the Chinook Fund, how grant-making decisions are made, and background regarding the January 1st, 2013 guideline revisions. First, we'll start off with a brief history of the Chinook Fund. It's often said that you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And, in the case of the Chinook Fund, the history represents the values and framework with which we were founded. These values are reflected in all of the work we do and are the basis of the funding guidelines. The Chinook Fund was founded in 1987 by a group of people who were shaped by and participated in the civil rights and peace movements of the 1960s and 1970s. They wanted to continue their commitment to social justice work and embrace social justice philanthropy and the equitable redistribution of wealth. Inspired by the recent founding of the Funding Exchange in New York, they wanted to give birth to a foundation that would support small, grassroots organizations working for peace, human rights, and economic justice. Because the group was no longer directly engaged in this work, they partnered with activists and community organizers working on racism and race relations, poverty, housing, LGBTQ rights, and disability rights to help craft, devise, and give birth to the Chinook Fund. The philosophy of impacted communities directing their own liberation was institutionalized. Over time, the organization actively pursued anti-racism work internally, which then evolved into an overall anti-oppression focus. Our mission statement reads as follows. The Chinook Fund is committed to the transformation of society into one that promotes social justice and freedom from oppression, including, but not limited to, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ageism, and ableism. As you can see from the mission statement, it is very much based in our history and also in our values. 3 of our key values include anti-oppression philosophy, leadership development, and accountability. Anti-oppression philosophy, or anti-oppression work, is the ongoing examination of power, privilege, and oppression. You'll notice that we have listed particular examples of oppression in our mission statement. The Chinook Fund is committed to modeling a representative and diverse staff, board, and volunteer base. We also strive to act on and uphold our values in the leadership of our organization by participating in ongoing anti-oppression education work within Chinook and within our work. We also very much value leadership development. We recognize that leaders of an organization interpret and often devise the mission statement and are responsible for upholding the values of an organization. They direct the work and the processes of an organization or group. So, leadership development is key, and it is also why the emphasis on leadership development is so strong within the application itself, and particularly within things like the diversity chart. The Chinook Fund is also strongly committed to accountability. This means a two-way street between the funder, or us, and the grantee. Regarding social justice philanthropy, I'll read you a quote. Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This quote reflects much of the Chinook Fund's understanding of social justice philanthropy. Social justice philanthropy. A definition of social justice philanthropy is as follows. It supports organizations and leaders who are working to address the root causes of inequity. This includes working toward long-term structural changes to increase access and opportunities for people who are targeted politically, economically, and/or socially. Social justice philanthropy includes giving and donations, how resources are managed, and more. 3 key aspects as they relate to the Chinook Fund include accountability. The recognition that foundations, which exist somewhere between the private and public spheres, are accountable to the communities they serve and to the tax-paying public at large. So you'll notice that accountability is here in social justice philanthropy as well as in Chinook Fund's core values, which we already reviewed. Transparency, needed at multiple levels of the foundation, including grant-making and decisions about who and why funding happens. And finally, democracy. The foundation operates with some form of democratic decision-making within the board, staff, and with engagement from the community it serves. Change, not charity. Social justice philanthropy, which very much comes from anti-oppression values, differentiates between social change work and charity or direct services work. While there is a great deal of very important and valuable direct services work, it is not the kind of work that addresses the root causes of social inequities, and it is not the work that the Chinook Fund funds. Let's go over a few examples. So, an example of what the Chinook Fund would consider to be charity work is sending money to a shelter for homeless families. That's a very valuable thing to do. However, an example of what the Chinook Fund would consider to be change work is sending money to a housing coalition working for more affordable housing. This is not the only example of social justice work in this area, but it is one. The 2 key things that differentiates the change work in this example from the charity work in this example is that when sending money to a homeless shelter, that benefits an individual or a group of individuals, whereas in the change example, the emphasis is on benefiting an entire community. Also, there's a difference between what is being addressed. In the second example, sending money to a housing coalition working for more affordable housing, this coalition is working to address one of the root causes of homelessness, which is lack of access to affordable housing. In the first example, it is meeting an already existing need, but not necessarily addressing the root causes of why homelessness exists. Let's go over another example. Chinook Fund would consider to be this an example of charity. Fund a scholarship for one immigrant high school student to attend college versus funding an immigrant student coalition organizing to ensure all youth, regardless of status, can access higher education. Again, in these 2 examples, there is a clear differentiation between something that would benefit one individual or a small group of individuals versus larger systemic changes that would make changes such that an entire community or entire group of youth would be able to have access to higher education. So one is a temporary change or temporary benefit for an individual or small group of individuals, while the other is a more long-term change that would benefit an entire group or community. Again, we emphasize change, not charity, and this is part of our social justice and anti-oppression philosophy and values. How we fund. The Chinook Fund recruits social justice activists from diverse communities across the state to sit on our Grantmaking Committee, or the GMC. Between 10 and 14 GMC members participate in funding decisions each cycle. These activists work across different identities and perspectives in a unique, consensus-based process to decide how best to allocate Chinook's resources. Our GMC members have direct experience working on the ground, meaning that they are better able to recognize effective work when they see it. And GMC members develop their own leadership, build solidarity and connections across movements, and learn about new methods for social change, which they take back to their own organizations and communities. We give control over money and decisions to the people most affected by the issues we fund. We follow the lead of impacted communities. This itself is an act of social change, and, as you will notice, is one of the integral components of social justice philanthropy. Here are a few pictures of our past grant-making committees. Aspects of the GMC process. The Grant-Making Committee reviews all of the applications that Chinook Fund receives during each grant-making cycle. After reviewing these applications, the GMC decides which applicants will be receiving site visits. Site visits are a critical part of the Chinook Fund application process and are weighed heavily in funding decisions. For Chinook, it is important that the largest possible number of constituents, members, and leaders be present at this meeting. Once site visits have happened, GMC members make decisions about who will receive funding. Funding allocation. After deciding which groups meet our criteria, the Grant-Making Committee divides grant dollars amongst all grant recipients. The dollar amount of our grant awards varies from cycle to cycle depending on the number of grant recipients and the amount we have been able to fundraise. So there's no set number of grantees, no set number of grants that can be made. There is one pot, and we will distribute that pot amongst all of the people that we think meet our funding criteria. The revised guidelines. As part of the Chinook Fund's commitment to be accountable to grantees and honor our anti-oppression and social justice philanthropy values, we conducted an extensive grant-making evaluation in 2012. In direct response to the feedback given by current and former grantees during this 2012 grant-making evaluation, the Chinook Fund published revised guidelines on January 1st of 2013. Because the evaluation was such an integral component of these changes, more of this process is described here. The goals of this evaluation were to modify funding criteria, guidelines, and grant-making processes to be more effective in seeding and supporting grassroots social change organizations and in achieving our mission. Explore if Chinook Fund's definition of effective social change resonates with grassroots social justice activists and organizations. Create space for Chinook Fund volunteers, grantees, and activists to build relationships, reflect on social change practice, and learn from one another. And capture and quantify the unique value and qualities of Chinook funding. Document the impact of Chinook funding on social justice organizations and movements in Colorado. So, this was done through a number of means. The methodology include focus groups. There were 8 focus groups throughout the state of Colorado. You can see the areas below. 38 organizations participated in focus groups. 36% of those were current grantees, 63% were former grantees, 55% were outside of the Denver metro area, and 45% were from the Denver metro area. Another methodology was surveying. We surveyed grantees who received a grant in the last 5 years. 37 organizations participated. Characteristics of the group included 66% of respondents who were from the Denver metro area, and 34% of respondents were from outside of the Denver metro area. 40% of participants had most recently received startup funding, while 60% had most recently received established funding. As you can see, there are other bullet points here that you are welcome to read. The survey was conducted anonymously so that the responses could not be linked to a specific organization or individual. Other aspects of the methodology included an internal analysis, grant history review, meaning an extensive cleanup of grant history data, a review of our grant history data for additional information and perspective, and looking for any trends and patterns. We also took this to a program committee. The program committee is made up of current and former members of the Grantmaking Committee, as well as other people who have been involved in the granting process. The program committee established research questions from 2008 to 2011 and met a number of times during 2012. They gave feedback and received training around focus group facilitation, initial discussion recommendations around grant making, policies, procedures, including GMC makeup. We also examined best practices in the field, including a grant-making review of the funding exchange sister funds and other social justice funds, funding guidelines, grant applications, internal procedures, policies, processes, and recent grantees and funding amounts. Overall, we found some of this as the following overview. In our history, up to 2012, the Chinook Fund had given out 791 grants. There were 302 grantees, and the total grant amount for that time period was $2,454,399. The main funding categories included racial justice, economic justice, LGBTQ justice, immigrant justice, environmental justice, and disability justice. The regional distribution of the funding included the Denver metro area receiving $1.68 million of the funding, or 69% of it, and the remaining parts of the state receiving $770,000 of the funding, or 31% of the funding. Key guideline revisions include multi-year funding for eligible organizations, improved diversity chart and narrative questions, expanded definition of social change to include movement building and creating alternatives to systems and institutions, and more detailed funding guidelines that provide clear examples of our criteria for effective social change. This ends part 1 of the 3-part grant application workshop series.